Go back to Africa! Go back to Africa! We hate you as much as we can, motherfucker! Go back to Africa! Go back Africa!
Waiting to help them on the beaches of Greece are the last people the Syrians might expect. Volunteers from Israel.
My name is Tali Shaltiel. I'm here with Israel, an Israeli-based NGO.
My name is Majida Kardosh. I'm here as a medical team. I work as a nurse.
My name is Iris Adler. I live in Tel Aviv. I just finished med school in Tel Aviv University.
We brought a team from Israel, which is Arab-speaking, and the effect was amazing.
Hearing your language is very important to them, and then getting the instructions where to go, what to do next.
It's the end of days. You're going to need the iron of Esav, which represents Edom, which is the West, Europe, and the Americas, to get intermixed with Ishmael, which is basically Arabs and Muslims. How in the world was this ever going to happen if not for this refugee crisis? At the end of days, you're going to have this intermixing between Esav, Edom, which is the West, and the East, which is the Muslims and the Arabs, making this through this influx into the world. And they're going to have children, I don't want to say by the dozens, but they're going to have a far larger birth rate than the indigenous people there, and they're going to sort of conquer by number. And there are many different sources for this. One of them in Yehezkel, chapter 14, and many other sources as far as this is concerned, where it's mentioned very, very vividly what will happen to the Jews and what will happen to Yerushalayim and what will happen to the world at that time, where there will be many, many people killed and so on and so forth. So the idea of having these refugees come into Europe, it's no longer a matter of whether it's right or wrong. It's just simply fulfillment of what it was meant to be all along. This is the fulfillment of the Hazal and the prophecies. This has to happen, and this is just another sign that we are nearing, the completion of this tikkun of the entire world.
Is Israel a racist country? As Black Lives Matter resonates around the world, where is the outrage for black lives in Israel? Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans to deport 40,000 African refugees, mainly from Eritrea and Sudan, to another country in Africa or back home. He calls them illegal infiltrators, criminals, economic opportunists, and says they're worse than terrorists.
התקפות חמורות של גורמי הטרור בסיני. והדבר הנורא ביותר, הצפה של מסתננים בלתי חוקיים מאפריקה.
Even some rabbis have joined in the racist rhetoric, comparing African people to monkeys.
כושי מברכים, אלא צריך שיהיה כושי שאבא שלו ואמא שלו לבנים. איפה אתה תדע? אם אתה יודע, כופה שאתה יודע,
These are asylum seekers we're talking about, like those from Eritrea, which is also referred to as Africa's North Korea, the same country Netanyahu wants to send these refugees back to. It's one of the highest refugee-producing countries in the world, even with a population of only around 5 million. A report by the UN has found that people in Eritrea face an authoritarian government, rape, torture, forced labour and enslavement. Aren't these good enough reasons to flee a country? And we can't ignore the situation in Sudan. It's even featured on lists like this. As if the life of these asylum seekers isn't hard enough. Now they're being persecuted for trying to seek refuge in Israel, the same country that's supposed to be a democratic nation. Israel was one of the first of 145 nations to sign the UN Convention on Refugees, which obligates Israel to help those in life-threatening situations. Instead, many have been locked up in prisons, placed in ghettos in impoverished parts of Tel Aviv, and denied work.
The whole of Israel will ultimately be fenced off for its own protection, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed. Inspecting the construction of a new barrier along the country's border with Jordan, he used strong language to evoke the threat. We'll surround Israel in its entirety? The answer is yes. In the environment we live in, we need to protect ourselves from predatory animals.
So, one of the things during the years is that Israel decided if we can't send them back to their country of origin, we're going to try and send them somewhere else. So part of this anti-infiltration law that was established in 2012 was the opening of something called the Hulot Detention Center. And Mr. Eli Yishai, who was the Interior Minister at 2012, stated very clearly what the intention was. He said, if we can't deport them, we will make their lives miserable until they choose to voluntarily leave.
אם ייתנו לי את כל הכלים, ואני פועל להשיג את כל הכלים, וזה לא קל. אם ייתנו לי את כל הכלים בלי יוצא מן הכלל, תוך פחות משנה לא יישאר בארץ ישראל אפילו מסתנן אחד.
And so what would happen was, people would be summoned to the Hulot Detention Center and they would be given a nice brochure in the other hand, which said, voluntary leave.
The detention facilities under construction are set to house between 8 to 10,000 illegal migrants.
אחת הסיבות לירידה המשמעותית והדרמטית במסתננים, הגדר מחד, ומאידך העובדה שהם נכנסים לתקופה ממושכת של 3 שנים בתוך בית סוהר. והם מודים למשפחות שלהם, ולכן הירידה היא מאוד מאוד משמעותית.
Yishai vowed that he'd work to expel all migrants who are not legitimate refugees, which he said includes all but a small number of over 60,000 migrants currently in Israel. He added that more detention facilities must be built in order to make the message clear that it is not possible to enter the country illegally.
You can, if you would like, go back to your country or go to another country that we have organized for you. We will pay for the flight ticket and we will also give you a $3,500 departure gift, and you can go and start your life there. The third country was never mentioned what it was. It was another African country that Israel had organized for them. As soon as Israel started sending people to third countries, we at the hotline, the organization where I work for, began monitoring what is really going on in these third countries. The state never said what the name is, even to people who were leaving. They never had any documentation until they arrived in the airport that said where they were going. And we knew that they were going to Uganda and Rwanda. They passed it was just a policy amendment saying that they are going to issue deportation orders to the third countries, and anyone who doesn't comply, they're going to put them in a proper detention, closed detention, not like this open Hulot detention center that they had created, in a proper closed detention center until they agree to leave. So they had been smuggled from Rwanda to Uganda, then to South Sudan, Libya, across the Mediterranean and to Europe. Every single one of them had either been given refugee status in Europe or were waiting to hear from their refugee claim in Europe. Where in Israel they had been called infiltrators over and over, in Europe they were found to be refugees. The report based on these 19 testimonies said the conclusion was that throughout the journey the refugees were subjected to human trafficking, incarceration, the threat of forcible deportation to Eritrea, harsh conditions of starvation, violence, slavery and torture camps in Libya, and a dangerous crossing of the Mediterranean Sea from Libya to Europe. Many witnessed the death of fellow travelers. Among the dead were others who had left Israel voluntarily. It says in the report that 18 of the 19 interviews were conducted in Hebrew. There is today in Europe a Hebrew-speaking Eritrean diaspora of people who lived for anywhere between 5 to 10 years in Israel, who learnt the language, who worked, who paid taxes, who lived amongst us, and then were sent away.
Yours is a voice of criticism we don't often hear in the United States. Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money, and the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong, and they are strong in this country. As you know, they have power, which it's okay. They are talented people, and they have power, money, and media, and other things. And their attitude is Israel, my country, right or wrong, the identification. And they are not ready to hear criticism. And it's very easy to blame people who criticize certain acts of the Israeli government as anti-Semitics, and to bring up the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people. And that justify everything we do to the Palestinians.
Since the spring of 2014, an estimated 3.6 million African and Middle Eastern migrants, 90% of which were younger men under the age of 35, illegally entered the continent of Europe by myriad land and sea routes. This unprecedented event, precipitated and managed by the hostile liberal elite, then required continuous mainstream propaganda and NGO support for the native European population to willingly accept its continued demographic demise. The details have been researched so abundantly that there is no need to discuss them further. However, what has never been explored to any significant degree is how this costly billion-dollar international scheme was paid for, and how the poorest people on earth were somehow able to walk right into the nations of Europe, which often required cold hard cash, and in sums they simply couldn't afford. Firstly, how does a 20-year-old youth from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the average yearly wage is about $400, come up with some $2,000 or more to pay for the long trek across the African continent into Libya, then onto a makeshift boat that could ferry him to a European port of call? Well, in short, someone gave it to him. The sum of $2,000 to a young African in any of the sub-Saharan regions is the equivalent of about $100,000 for a similarly aged, unmarried young person living in America. Young people from these areas simply do not have that sort of cash. There have been numerous reports of NGO trucks and black unmarked vehicles operating in the vicinities of well-known pickup points along the early stages of these migration routes. And although these culprits, handlers, and exchangers of currency have been difficult to source, there is no question that large quantities of money are being funneled in somehow. The total operational transport cost to all migrants who illegally entered Europe over the past 5 years is estimated to be about $8 billion. This was paid mostly in cash. Such an alarming total exceeds even the GDPs of some of these countries put together. And there is absolutely no way that all of this money came from third world pockets. So, where did it come from? About a year ago, the infamous globalist hegemon, George Soros, admitted to divesting some $18 billion of net worth into a number of his NGO platforms, and in particular, the Open Society Foundation, which is the umbrella entity or Politburo that operates hundreds of globalizing progressive organizations that now encircle the planet. This had been done over the previous 2-year period. The money essentially disappeared for all intents and purposes, as no one cared to audit the so-called charity, and it had become so vast that no one would have even known where to begin. This largesse would have no doubt been enough to cover monies owed at the ground level for the operational costs of the migrant flooding of Europe. Although the NGOs supporting this already had the existing financial flexibility to aid in the day-to-day movement of migrants, including the use of modern transport vessels sailing in the Mediterranean, many of which, interestingly, owning Israeli shipping registrations.